stories. But then we will have a Malice in Memphis business meeting. And those of you who are not members of Malice will probably not want to stay to hear us discuss officers and the anthology and the progress of our anthology, that sort of thing. So I want to just tell you that there probably has not, in our lifetime, not been too many short story writers with as much success in publishing and editing as Michael Bracken. Michael has had published 1,300 short stories. And at one time, I think, didn't you have a short story in every Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Weekly, every major magazine at one time, which is just like, to me, just absolutely phenomenal. He has also edited 9 anthologies, and I know that Jim and Angelin will be shocked to see him in such good condition because they have edited our anthology. And oh wait, Carolyn is here and so is Dee. So yes, they have edited our anthology and are wondering probably how you look so good after editing 9. He writes just about everything: advertising, copy, chapters of books on how to be a short story writer, how to write. He speaks at corporate seminars. But for today, he's going to talk to us about how to sell what we write. This is, to me, a phenomenally interesting topic. And so I'm going to turn it over to Michael Bracken. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you for having me. And Lynn, if you'd set up my, you already did. Thank you. There. I'm going to talk about writing and selling short fiction, predominantly on how to sell it, find markets for it. And I'm going to concentrate on selling mystery and crime fiction, but the same general ideas will apply no matter what genre you write. Okay, come on, get back. Okay. A PDF of the PowerPoint slide is going to be sent to you or be available to you. I've already sent it to Lynn and Jackie, and they can forward copies to you. I think they're going to put it on their website. So as she said, my background, I'm author of about 16 books. That includes both novels and short story collections. Author of about 1,300 short stories. I'm the editor of Black Cat Mystery Magazine. Editor of 9 published or forthcoming anthologies, including the Anthony Award nominated The Eyes of Texas, Private Eyes from the Panhandle to the Piney Woods. And the winner of that contest gets announced next Saturday at the virtual BoucherCon. I also edit a consumer magazine that's available on newsstands called Texas Gardener, for obviously gardeners in Texas. And I've been doing about 15 years on that. And I edit a weekly online newsletter for gardeners, primarily aimed at gardeners in Texas. So, and I've had other editing background. So I've worked not just on the fiction side of publishing, but also on the nonfiction side. So why are some short story writers published much more often than others? And the key thing is, number one, they write more. They are highly productive. They submit more, meaning and they don't give up. They just keep at it. They continue to turn out more stories. To write more, 2 key things. You have to establish a routine for your writing. Everybody's routine is going to be different. It may be that you write every morning before work. It may be that you write every evening before bed. It may be that you make notes during the week and do your actual writing in a large block of time on the weekend. Whatever your routine is, establish one and get that pattern of constantly producing material. The second thing is you have to finish what you write. If your goal is to write 1,000 words a day and you do a wonderful job of that, but you never finish anything, you'll never have anything to submit. And the great many writers, especially beginning writers, fall into that habit where they write and they rewrite and they revise, but they never actually finish anything. So it's really important. Even if it's bad, at least it's done. So on submitting, you have to submit everything you finish. And you have to keep submitting it. One of the dilemmas some writers have is they get rejections and they stop. Many, many years ago, I had a friend who was also a writer. He would write a story, he would submit it, it would get rejected, and he would put it in his filing cabinet and said, well, if they don't want it, nobody will want it. And I would send a story out 10, 12, 15, 18, 100 times because I thought the story was good enough to be published. And I may be wrong. After 100 rejections, you kind of figure, well, I was wrong. But I didn't stop after one rejection, after one submission. In most cases, you want to submit to the top markets in your genre first. In our genre, mysteries, that's Alfred Hitchcock and Ellery Queen. If they reject your story, work down to the secondary markets, the tertiary markets, and on down. Unlike one of your previous speakers, Robert Lopresti, who targets only the top markets, I'm not afraid to go deeper because my goal is to be published. And if I can't always hit the top markets, well, there's so many other markets out there. You have to set whatever your standard is, that you will not send to anything that pays less than this or that has fewer than this copies distributed, whatever your standards are. But in the beginning, your first goal is to get published somewhere and work up from there. Submit until there are no more markets. Say you write a mystery and you've submitted to the top 2 or 3 markets and all the secondary markets and all the open anthologies. There's no place else to send it. You set it aside for a while. New opportunities happen all the time. New magazines start being published. New anthology calls come out, and your story may fit one of those. Submit it again. I had one story, I believe it took me 17 years to sell it. But it sold, and it sold to a top paying market. But that market did not exist when I wrote the story. So submit again, and keep submitting. Very, very important is don't give up on yourself. Don't give up on your stories. Just don't give up. Too many writers or would-be writers quit too soon. If you really want to be a writer, you have to learn to live with rejection, realize you are not being rejected in 99% of the cases. It's not you. Either the story isn't ready for publication or it's not appropriate for the place you sent it. For example, you wouldn't send a children's story to a men's magazine. You wouldn't send a men's magazine story to a children's magazine. So maybe you're targeting wrong and you need to rethink where you're sending your work. But ultimately, do not give up. Okay, how to write a short story is somebody else's presentation. I haven't got time today to teach you how to write, and there are probably better teachers you can have talk to you on the writing side. But a few things that are critically important is that you have to master the basics. You need to be able to spell and punctuate. Sadly, a lot of beginning writers have problems with that. You need to understand story structure. What's a beginning, what's a middle, what's an end? How do the pieces fit together so that you have a story, not an anecdote or not a series of events. You need to understand manuscript format. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail later. And then you really, truly need to understand how to use Microsoft Word. You have to understand how to format, and you have to understand how to clean the crud out of the stories that you send. Even though your story may print well, what you see on the screen or the actual document can be filled with trash. And I spend a lot of my time cleaning trash out of things before I even get to the editing stage. So for example, in Word, you can turn on what's called non-printing characters. And if you turn on non-printing characters, you will suddenly discover that your stories are littered with extra spaces. You're using tab keys when you shouldn't be using tab keys. You're putting in various other codes that are the wrong codes. So really study up on how to use Microsoft Word. That's at the beginning stage. Later, as you get accepted and get edited, a great many editors use track changes. You have to know how to use track changes. And this is not the seminar for that, but get out an instruction manual, go online to YouTube, find a friend who's familiar with it, understand how to use Microsoft Word, how to use show non-printing character, and especially how to use and understand track changes. Okay, but here's the goal. How do you sell a story? You've mastered all of that. You understand Word. You know how to write a story. Your spelling and punctuation is good. Now you want to find a place to submit your story. And it's a simple process. You find a market, you submit it, you wait forever for a response from some markets. And very importantly, don't stop writing. While you're waiting for a response to that story, be writing your second story, your third story, your fourth story. Don't stop. You are a literary shark. If you stop, you die. So keep writing. Finding markets. At any given moment, there are hundreds of anthologies and periodicals seeking short stories. Every time some writer tells me, oh, there's no place to send my story, that tells me they're not trying hard enough. Because I can, at any moment, find dozens of stories that are looking, dozens of markets that are looking for stories today. The question becomes, A, do I write those kind of stories, or can I write those stories? And B, is that a market I would want to be published in? So saying there are no markets means you're not trying hard enough to find them. And remember, until you're well established, no editor is going to come looking for you. You have to put the work in to find their publications. So in the mystery field, start with the top three. Alfred Hitchcock's and Ellery Queen's are the best paying mystery magazines. They're the most prestigious. You get published in one of them, it goes on your writer resume until the day you die, because they're a top market. Black Cat Mystery Magazine is probably, I'm the editor, so I hate to say this, it's probably the #2 magazine because it's the second best paying mystery market out there. And it is a newer magazine. We just published our 7th issue. So it's also a good market you need to be familiar with. But there are many other publications you should be reading, or at least be knowledgeable about. And just off the top of my head, the other night I listed Black Beacon Books, Coffin Hop Press, Dark House Books, Level Best Books. They all publish anthologies regularly and post on their website what they're looking for. Various magazines include Down and Out the Magazine, O'Connell Clash Review, on through this list I have, and many others. In addition to those that are specific to the mystery field, and I'm talking like I'm wired on caffeine, I know that, because I am wired on caffeine. In addition to that, there are magazines that are not primarily mystery magazines, such as Women's Weekly, publishes 52 mysteries a year and 52 romances a year. Most writers who only write mysteries may not be aware of that woman's magazine. Saturday Evening Post occasionally publishes mystery, and yes, it's still being published. For those of us who are older and remember its heyday, well, it still publishes fiction. The Strand, which is primarily a nonfiction magazine about the mystery field, publishes fiction. So there are just the ones that are being published today. There's a dozen, 2 dozen right now, regular magazines. Plus the conventions. Malice Domestic on the East Coast, annual convention, publishes an anthology every year. BoucherCon, which floats around on locations, publishes an anthology every year. And you do not have to be an attendee at those conventions to submit to their anthologies. In addition to those, join various Facebook groups. I listed 3 here. The top one, Open Call, Crime, Thriller, Mystery Markets. Editors go on that Facebook group and they post their calls for submission. It says, I'm looking for stories about instant mind blank. I'm looking for stories about mystery stories set in Appalachia. I'm looking for cozy mysteries. I'm looking for private eye stories, whatever. And there are, I've only listed 3, and I think I'm a member of a dozen of these, where editors go to these various Facebook groups and post their submission calls. Join mystery writing organizations and other organizations for other genres as well. For the Mystery Writers of America, Private Eye Writers of America, Short Mystery Fiction Society, Sisters in Crime. Mystery Writers publishes an anthology every year, but you have to be a member. Private Eye Writers of America publishes anthologies irregularly. You have to be a member. Sisters in Crime, the various chapters publish anthologies regularly. You have to be a member. Short Mystery Fiction Society has only published sort of 1 anthology, but it's a group of short mystery, writers of short mystery fiction. We're not all short writers. And they're constantly sharing information. Oh, have you heard about this market? Or, I just sold a story to that market. It's mostly writers sharing information with each other, but sometimes editors get on there and share a submission call. Learn to use your search engine. You tend to use Google, but in your, and I just forgot what it's called, the little bar at the top where you type in URLs, you can type in, for example, quote mark, call for submissions, end quote mark, capital and the word mystery. And it will go out and look for all calls for submissions for mystery stories. And you can change it up. Look for calls for submissions. Now, these would tend to be anthologies if it's a call for submissions, and crime fiction or submission guidelines and short stories. And what happens is these are constantly changing, but once you get a list of possible hits, you need to winnow that down, because you don't want to look for an anthology that closed a year ago. So I tend to winnow it down to previous week or previous month, so I get current calls. And again, if depending on how you set your parameters, you will find calls for romances and horror stories and any genre you can imagine. Another tip is purchase the best of year anthologies in the genre that you most want to publish in. In our case, it's going to be the best American mystery stories published every single year. What the editors consider the top 20 stories of the year are published in the anthology, and another 30 are considered listed as also, they're also rans, basically. So you get a list of the top 50 mystery stories and information on where every single one of those stories was published. And I can guarantee you're going to find at least one market, and probably a dozen or more, of publications you've never heard of. And that gives you, well, go out and look at that publication. Is it a journal? Is it a magazine? Was it an anthology? Who published it? Are they looking for things now? Follow the Facebook and Twitter accounts of editors. I have discovered, you wind up with a lot of political stuff you're not interested in, but if you keep reading their accounts, for example, on Twitter, I found a handful of markets in the past year on Twitter that I didn't see listed anywhere else, because the editor was on Twitter and made some sort of an announcement. Editors do the same thing on their Facebook account. Maxim, that's his first name, was editing a series of anthologies, and the only place that I found that he put a submission call was on his Facebook feed. And of the 4 anthologies he announced that way, I sold to 2 of them. Well, actually, co-author and I sold to 2 of them. Same thing with blogs and websites of editors. Follow editors. Next thing is follow prolific writers and learn where their work is published. If you want to know where the markets are, follow me, follow John Floyd, follow Art Taylor. Because we like to announce that we've had something published, and you go, oh my goodness, I never heard of that place. An example of that is John Floyd and Josh Pachter announced that they sold to an anthology published by Black Beacon Books in France. I'd never heard of them. I went online, found the publisher, found they had another anthology opening, read the anthology call, wrote a story, submitted it to them. I never would have heard about that if I'd not been following these other writers. Bad news is they rejected the story. Good news is the next editor I sent it to bought it. But I never would have written the story, never would have known about the market if I wasn't following other writers. And another very important thing is to make friends and share market information with each other. Your best insider tips often come from your friends. I have a friend named Laird Long. He is the most prolific living short story writer I know. He doesn't have a website, and he writes under multiple names. So even if you find his work, you'll only see a very small fraction of it under his own name. Well, because we both write in multiple markets, we are constantly sharing insider information. I have similar relationships with a couple of other writers, primarily mystery writers, so the information we share tends to be limited to information in the mystery field. Who's buying, who's not buying, offbeat markets they found or I found that publish mysteries that aren't announced as mystery markets. And especially if you're beginning, and you find somebody who writes something similar to you that you have a good relationship with, and that back and forth information, don't hide it. Don't, oh, I found it, I'm not sharing with anybody, because what you share with them and what they share with you, you will both grow. You both grow. Okay. Actually submitting short stories. Always read and follow the guidelines. Whatever the editor wants you to do it or come as close as you possibly can. But unless you're specifically told not to, and sometimes this happens when they have a blind submission, put your name, your address, your telephone number, and your email address on the first page of your manuscript. When you submit via email, oftentimes your submission, your attachment, is removed and put in a file folder, and your email, and it's separated from your email. If I can't find, if I have your manuscript, I read it and I say I want to publish this, and I can't find you, you've lost a sale. And I had happened recently with a writer whose work I liked. No contact information on the manuscript. Sorry, I'm only going to make so much effort to find you, because you obviously don't want to be found. Unless specifically instructed otherwise, 12-point Times New Roman, double spaced, no extra space between paragraphs. There's a sample coming up on the next screen. Use the paragraph functioning, formatting function in Word. And again, if the editor tells you something otherwise, do what the editor says. But these are general guidelines. And then again, unless specifically instructed otherwise, put a header on every page. It includes your name, the story title, and page number. Some of us are still Luddites and we print things on paper before we read them. If we drop your manuscript on the floor and there aren't page numbers, and we try to put it back together, it looks like you made a quilt with your eyes closed. We want to be able to put things back in order easily. Now, there are some editors who are so gung-ho about computers that it never sees paper until print. That's fine, but I'm not one of them. Here's a sample of the manuscript format. This is the first 2 pages of a story I sold to Alfred Hitchcock's mystery magazine that was published earlier this year. So you can see what it should look like. And I only gave you the first 2 pages. If you want to read it, you need to buy Alfred Hitchcock's. And again, although I've phonied out my phone number, everything else on there are ways to contact me. In a real manuscript, it would be my real phone number. Approaching editors. At this point, editors are not your friends. They might be someday, but right now they are not. So you need to be professional in every encounter with an editor. Keep your cover letter, which is your first contact. It's the first thing, in most cases, they will know about you. Well, all they will know about you is your cover letter professional. So keep it very simple. In general, editors don't need to know the name of your cat. They don't need to know what school you went to. They don't need to know, they don't need a 3-paragraph description of your story. They just need to keep it very simple. Samples coming up. Tell the editor what's enclosed or what's attached. Include a brief note about previous sales if you have any. Brief mention of any connection you may have with an editor, and conclude appropriately. So, simple cover letter, and this is one I use this format quite often. Attached is hippie homicide, 3,000-word PI story that may be appropriate for your upcoming anthology, Groovy Gumshoes. That's a real anthology I'll start reading next month. I look forward to hearing from you soon. If you've sold a few things or you have a couple of significant sales, you add a sentence that describes what you've sold and where. And for example, if you have a connection with the editor, for example, if you submitted something to me, you could say, I learned of your open call anthology during your Zoom presentation, and I appreciate your willingness to read submissions from new writers. That tells me, oh, we have a connection, however slight it might be. But that connection might be, I had lunch with your brother yesterday and he mentioned something. We are both members of such and so fraternity and I learned about your publication from there. Again, keep it simple. We don't need to find out that we're 23rd cousins through Aunt Martha's second dog or whatever. Keep it very simple. Again, occasionally you will have editors who want more in their cover letter, but they tell you that in their submission guidelines. As you gain experience and you develop relationships with editors, and you add to your list of published stories, your cover letters may become more casual. For example, one editor I sometimes correspond with, I ask about her dog. Another editor I correspond with, our wives actually know each other now. So sometimes say hello to your wife, and my wife says hello to your wife. And so there's other stuff in there, but still the fundamentals are professional, and never be unprofessional. Unprofessional, for example, is calling an editor a name, especially if they reject you. When encountering editors in the real world, conferences, conventions, Zoom meetings, the same rules basically apply. Be professional. Don't be drunk. Don't be high. Don't be rude. Don't do anything that would embarrass your mother if she heard about it. So what happens is, if, for example, at BoucherCon, a lot of things happen in the bar at BoucherCon. And there's a lot of alcohol in the bar at BoucherCon. But if you do things that are embarrassing, what you do, word gets around. Well, so-and-so got drunk and threw up on so-and-so's shoes. You go, maybe I don't want to work with that writer. That doesn't seem real professional. And then treat other writers with the same level of professionalism. In this field, in writing, there are many times where writers are now editors. And that writer you dissed as a writer is now an editor, and they remember that you dissed them, they might not want to work with you. But if you treat each other with a level of professionalism, general courtesy, when they're editors, they might remember the good things you did, but they will definitely remember the rudeness and bad things you've done. Very, very, very important. Check your spam folder every day. Often for some of us, occasionally for others of us, important email gets sidetracked into our spam folders. I've had several acceptances that I found in my spam folder. And had I not checked my spam folder, I would not have known about them. And this works on the flip side. If you're an editor, you should also check your spam folder every day. As an editor, if I write to a writer and say, I'd like to publish your story, blah, 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 and they don't respond back, I presume they're not interested. And it may simply be that they may be thrilled to death if they found the email that's lost in their spam folder. You don't want to lose a sale because you have not been regularly checking that folder. Respond promptly to every email that requires a response. If an editor asks you a question, if an editor does anything that requires a response, respond promptly. A rejection never requires a response. No means no, thank you, we're done. Unfortunately, some writers don't understand that and they send back. The worst thing is writers going, well, you're not smart enough to publish my story, or why are you so dumb, or the various other insults. And that puts them on the I will never work with that writer list again. Never again work with that writer. Now, you might think it's polite to say thank you very much for your kind comments, but again, editors are going through potentially hundreds of emails a day. They don't need to know that your thanks. I mean, it's nice to hear it, but we don't have time to deal with all that. We're trying to decide on all these other stories. Again, dealing with responses. If an editor requests a revision to a story, you do it. If you disagree with any part of it, discuss the requested changes with the editor. For example, I had a story accepted yesterday. The editor had requested a couple of dozen changes. There are maybe 5 of them I disagree with. Sometime later today, I will write back, say, yes, I agree with all these changes, but I disagree with these, and here's why. And there'll be a little back and forth. This is why I did it this way and why I'd like it to stay, or I see why you wanted that change, but here's a better way to fix that problem. If you are so married to your words that you won't work with an editor, you're going to kill your career. There are very few writers who are so good that every letter they type is golden. I have not met one yet, but I've met many who thought they were. Contracts. If you get a contract from an editor, you need to read it, understand it, sign it, and return it. But do not ask your editor to explain it. That's a sure sign that you're a beginner, and you don't want, even if you are a beginner, you don't want to look like a beginner. If you do not understand your contract, remember all those friends you made earlier that you're sharing information with? Ask for their advice and their help. If you're really worried, you can go to an intellectual property lawyer to explain the contract to you. That costs a lot of money, and it may or may not be worth spending the money. So the best thing is read it, and read it well, so that you understand what you're signing. It is, if you sign a bad contract, it is your fault, not the editor's fault. And I have signed bad contracts in the past, knowing full well they were bad contracts because I needed the money right then. 10 years later, I'm going, damn, why'd I do that? But right then I needed the money. So you have to sometimes make a decision. The perfect contract will probably never land in your lap. And if you're not going to sign the contract, say, I don't like those terms, sorry, and turn down the sale. The next time you're working with the editor will be in, these are not revisions, these are copy edits and page proofs. That's when a copy editor goes through and decides that they want Oxford commas and you didn't use Oxford commas. That's a style choice of the publishers. That is not the hill you want to die on. Whether Oxford commas are the publisher style or not the publisher style is not the thing to argue about. If they go through and they determine the word gray should be G-R-A-Y, you spell it G-R-E-Y every time, again, that's not the hill to die on. But go through the copy edits and ensure that everything is legitimate. Occasionally a copy editor will make a slip and they will do something change something that was correct to something incorrect. In that case, point it out. Say, an example of that happened several years ago to me. I had a character who wore a rep, R-E-P, a rep tie. Men who work in management positions probably know what a rep tie is. My editor was a woman who probably never wore a tie in her life. She thought I meant a red tie. And so I had to correct her and say, no, rep tie is correct. It's a little thing, but sometimes the copy editors don't know something or they're unclear. Another good example of that was a story I wrote. A redneck character in Texas had a beer window on his truck. The editor had no clue what a beer window was, and I had to explain it. They're big in Texas. It's the little window behind the driver to the back to the bed of the truck. That is used if your cooler's high enough, you can reach back and grab a beer, or if you're being stopped by the cops, you can toss your open can into the back, and then you're not violating open container laws when they arrest you or to attempt to arrest you or stop you. That's the beer window on a pickup truck. Study your sales and your acceptances. For example, you sent 10 stories to an editor and she accepted your 10th story. And you go, what is different about this story than the previous 9? You might get a hint in your acceptance letter. The editor says, I really liked these characters. And you look back and you see, well, I developed my characters more fully in this story than in the previous 9. Or they might say, I like what you did with the setting. Oh, well, what did I do different with setting? They might not tell you anything, but you look at it and the first 9 stories you sent were twist in the tail stories. But the 10th one you sent was more of a character study. Oh, well, this gives you an idea of how to tailor future submissions to that editor. You can do this also by, if you read a magazine regularly, you can start to see patterns. A group of women's magazines I wrote for many years ago, their submission guidelines didn't ever specifically say it, but if you read the magazines, you realize every single story was written in first person. So you know right off, they're not going to buy a third person story. 98, 99% of the stories had a female protagonist. Well, you might sell them a male protagonist story, but your odds are much better with a female protagonist story. They never, ever allowed brand names in their stories. So your characters never went to McDonald's, they went to fast food joints. They never drove a Chevy, they drove an SUV or a sedan. So those are things, so study not only your own stories, but stories that are being published. And use that knowledge to guide your future submissions. Then begin to establish a working relationship with your editors. Emphasize this again, always be professional. You can ask questions carefully. Some editors are open to lots of questions, some editors aren't. But an example of that, a writer I sort of knew, we weren't best buds, we'd only met at a couple of events. When I was editing The Eyes of Texas, he really wanted to write a story for it. And so he asked me several questions about things that weren't in the actual guidelines. I was able to answer his questions, and ultimately when he finally submitted the story, I bought it. It's in the anthology. He took the time to ask questions, and I was the type of editor, I was willing to answer them. But they were very specific, pointed questions. Is this acceptable or is this not? It wasn't like, well, what font do I put it in? No, you should already know that stuff. Be dependable. If you tell an editor, I will have that to you by Monday, or I will whatever. If you say you're going to do something, do something. Now, occasionally, let's be honest, you say, if I told an editor I was going to have something to him Monday, and I get off the Zoom call to find out my wife's been in an accident, she's in the hospital, I'm probably going to miss that deadline. But as soon as I can, I will contact that editor and say, here's what happened. Can you extend the deadline for me? And most editors, most of the time, are willing to do that because they build in a little gap, and the deadline they give you is not always their hard and fast deadline. So, but if you're doing this every single assignment, then obviously you have a problem with your life you have to deal with, not a deadline problem, not a dependability problem. Follow directions. If an editor tells you to do something in a certain way, do it. Unfortunately, getting writers to follow guidelines is like herding cats blindfolded. And that's unfortunate, but follow the directions, meet your deadlines, and then be open to opportunities, because you never know when something will land in your lap unexpectedly. Even though you don't have a lot of credentials or don't have a lot of experience, maybe you're at that bar at BoucherCon and you happen to be sitting with a table, there's 6 of you there. You and your best bud who's about your level as a beginner, a couple of established writers, an editor walks up and they're all sitting around talking, and the editor says, I'm working on this new anthology, blah, blah, blah. And you go, man, that's the kind of story I'd like to write. Well, that's your opportunity to introduce yourself. Hello, Miss Editor. My name is Michael Bracken. I've never written that kind of story, and I'm kind of a beginner, but I would love the opportunity to submit a story to you. And chances are, not guaranteed, they'll look at it on spec, which means on speculation. They won't guarantee they'll buy it, but you've now given yourself an opportunity to submit to a place you never would have heard of before, and you're willing to, you let the editor know that you're interested and you've got your opening. And those happen, it might be in your Zoom meeting, it might be in at a convention, it might be just you're hanging out and an email pops up. Opportunities are weird how they happen. For example, a story I had accepted for an anthology this week, a couple of weeks ago, and this has happened to me, I'll get more detail later. One editor, he said, I'm doing this anthology, we have space for 12 stories. The writer of one of the stories crapped out, not his words, and didn't deliver. Can you write this story? And he told me what he wanted. And I need it turned around really quickly. I could say yes, I could say no. I looked at it, was able to do it, said yes, I'd like to do that. I did it, he accepted it. A longer version of that, several years ago, I was attempting to sell stories to a woman's magazine. And I'd send the stories out and they'd come back with form rejection letters. And this happened for a while. One day a story comes back there, says, I like it, but a whole list of things that needed to be changed. So I revised it and sent it, and she bought it. And then the next couple of stories were like that. I like it, but a whole bunch of revisions, and she'd buy the story. And then she started buying stories without revisions. And then after a couple of years, I discovered she liked to work with a stable of writers. She didn't buy a lot of over the transom submissions. She sends an email to her core writers and says, Beverly, I need you to write this story about such and so. Here's the link, here's the deadline. Michael, I need this story about such and so. Here's the deadline, here's the guidelines. It's about a 1-paragraph description. There are about 6, 7 writers who would get this. And it was every month. And so, wow, I'm in now. I don't even have to think of my own ideas anymore. So I'm writing these. And then along comes one Friday, and she said, email says, Michael, one of the other writers missed the deadline. I need a 5,000-word story by Monday morning about this topic. She gave me a paragraph description. Can you do it? I'd written 5,000-word stories, but I'd never written one in 2 days, ever in my life. And I said, yes, I can. And turned out, if I shut down the entire rest of my life, I can write a 5,000-word publishable story in 2 days. You don't get a lot of sleep. I did it. She bought it. And then from then on, I started getting 2 and 3 story assignments every month because I was open to the opportunity to turn something around that quickly. Another way to, and that was in developing relationships with editors, but another way to turn one sale into many, you know what, I'm gonna go back one. Other thing in establishing your relationship with editors, some editors only do open submission calls. I had one editor who did open submission calls and got so tired of going through the slush that he started doing invitation only things. So in working with an editor, when you've established that you can do what they want, you can get on their list of writers they might use for invitation only projects. So by proving your professionalism, your dependability, ability to follow directions and meet deadlines, you get on that list of people editors like to work with. But another way to turn one sale into many is to leverage your ideas. Some writers do that with series characters, even in short stories. I've got 2 private eyes that have, actually I have 3 private eyes that have actually appeared in 6 or 7 stories each. So I don't have to rethink all the characters every time. Well, I know the protagonist, and I just need a story for that protagonist. Reusable settings. I have a whole series of stories that are set in West Texas. And if you read enough of them, you start to realize there's a group of towns that these stories all appear in. The people travel between the towns. Secondary characters in some stories are also secondary characters in other stories. Settings are reusable. So you don't need to recreate every time you write a story. You have to study New York City and write a story in New York. And then you have to really study Memphis and write a story in Memphis. And really study Austin and write a story in Austin. Well, you may just be able to reuse settings you've already established. Something you can do is use holiday lists. It doesn't work quite as well in the mystery field, but back to the women's magazines I wrote for, I realized that they liked holiday stories. So in December, they got a Christmas story. In January, they got a New Year's Eve story. In February, they got a Valentine's Day story. In March, they got a St. Patrick's Day story. In August, or September, they got a back to school story. I got to the point where I was coming up with holidays I'd never heard of. Do you know there's a chocolate chip cookie day? And I wrote a short story where chocolate chip cookie day was important to the story. So consider using that. And if you read like Alfred Hitchcock's and Ellery Queen, they often have holiday stories every year. They don't do all the holidays, but they do like Christmas and Hanukkah. So those are good things to help you structure your story and give you story ideas. The advantage is it's very clear when the story would be published, but it really limits the places that would publish them. And then you can use reusable premises. It's not so good if your premise is the same, if they're all mysteries. But for example, I took one story idea, which was about a high school reunion. And I wrote a woman's fiction story about a holiday reunion, not holiday reunion, a class reunion, high school class reunion story. I thought, well, I can write another class reunion story, and I wrote a horror story. Now, I could probably reuse that premise again and do a mystery where somebody's killed at the class reunion. So look at fundamental premises that can be used in multiple genres or over multiple stories. some random tips. Generally aim for about 3,500 words, unless you're writing to a specific call. This is a link that is at the long end for the publication that seek short stories, and it's at the short end for stories that seek long short stories. So it kind of fits into most publications' word length guidelines. Again, it's not a hard and fast rule. It's just kind of a guideline. If you don't know how long to write a story, that's a good target length, somewhere around 3,500. Don't ever limit yourself to a single genre, because you might not ever discover what you're best at. For example, I started out as a science fiction fantasy writer. I was going to be the next Isaac Asimov or Robert Heinlein, and I wasn't doing too good at it. I sold a few stories. And then through circumstance, a comment an editor made to me, I wrote a mystery, and so I sold my very first mystery. Then that same editor bought my second mystery. Then I sold my third mystery to another magazine. I'm going, maybe I should learn something here. I'm doing a lot better with mysteries than I ever did with science fiction and fantasy. And that's what told me to not limit myself. I've also done very well in other genres. I still don't do real well at science fiction and fantasy. I sell one every couple of years. The other genres I'm doing fine at. And you might discover what you really like to read isn't necessarily what you're best at writing. So be open to experimenting. Don't let other people put limits on you or make you think ill of your story, because there's only two people in the entire world who have to like your story. You have to like it well enough to make the time and effort to submit it to editors, and only one editor in the whole world needs to like it well enough to publish it. So it doesn't matter what your pastor thinks, what your mother thinks, what your spouse thinks, what your kids think, what the neighbors think, what your writers group thinks. What really matters, number one, is whether you're confident that's the best you can do at this point in your career, and you have to make the time and effort to find the one editor who agrees with you. And then don't give up. Don't ever give up. That's the official presentation. And I'm going to take a deep breath. Okay. And then Jackie sent me a list of questions you all would like to have answered, and I'll just kind of rush through that. There wasn't time to incorporate them into the actual presentation. How has your career as a writer been helped or hurt because you also edited a crime mystery magazine and published anthologies? What have you learned as an editor? The key thing I have learned as an editor is that most writers don't follow instructions. And that has helped me. It has been very beneficial, because if I'm the guy who follows instructions, I have a leg up on all the rest of you. And part of that I've discovered is I don't have to write the best story that's in the anthology. I've made a career of being the guy who's the middle of the anthology, back of the magazine. I rarely get my name on the cover, but I'm not Stephen King. I'm not James Patterson or whoever your favorite best name author is, but I'm dependable. I meet the deadline. Story is to theme. It's what the editor needs. So what I've learned is be professional, be dependable, follow instructions. What is the hardest part of editing a magazine or collection of stories? The hardest part is the longer you do this, the longer you're part of the writing community, the more friends you make. So the hardest part is probably when I have to reject a story for somebody I really like. That it feels kind of, it's not personal, but it feels personal. You might be my best friend at the convention. We might hang out. We have great conversations, but this story didn't fit my anthology at this time, and it just doesn't. So that hurts. And it hurts worse when they're the editor and I'm the writer and they do that. How should a writer approach an editor about a story? I think I covered that. Similar to the other question, what is the hardest part of publishing an anthology? Again, the having to reject work by people who are friends. Now, in terms of physical work, editing is hard because you want to correct the errors but not interfere with the writer's style. What do I think of self-published anthologies? A good anthology is a good anthology. So I'm neither pro nor con. What do you look for in a short story when a new writer's work crosses your desk? The same thing I'm looking for in the work of an established writer. Does it attract my attention? Am I interested? Does it meet my guidelines? You can send me a brilliant story, but if it's 1,000 words too short and it's a private eye story when I wanted cozies, it doesn't matter. So I look for those things. And then I also look for spelling, punctuation. If in the first page I find multiple errors, I might not read much further, because if you can't get it reasonably correct on the initial submission, it indicates you're likely to be difficult to work with down the line. And there are some professional writers who are like that, just like new writers. When you write a short story or novel, what do you begin with, characters or plot? Neither. I most often begin with an opening scene, something that I think, well, something that attracts me to reading. What grabs me as a reader? And I think of those and I write that opening scene. Sometimes that's a character-driven scene. Sometimes it's a plot-driven scene. Sometimes it's a setting-driven scene. But it's a scene that gets the reader into the story. Then usually have to stop after I've written a scene and go, well, what is this story about? Then I have to figure out a plot, more setting, etc. But if I don't have that initial opening, I never get to the point where I'm worried about plot or characters. And which of your stories is favorite? Oh my God, I have 1,300 children. They're all my favorite. But I'll recommend two. A story called Smoked, S-O-M-K-E-D. It was included in the Best American Mystery Stories, I think it was 2018. It is about as close to perfect as a story I've ever written. Every element works, and it works exactly the way I wanted it to, and it builds to the conclusion I wanted. And then the other one, you get the couple of opening paragraphs in the PDF, was Sleepy River, earlier this year in Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. I wrote a story unlike my usual stories. I put myself in the head of a teenage girl to write the story. And it was really a stretch for me to write that story. And again, I think every element worked and the story worked. So we'll call them my favorites today. Tomorrow the answer might be different. And that's the presentation. That's the questions you sent in advance. So I'm right about my time limit. So
Michael, I actually have one more question that came from Ed. He asked, do you have an Excel spreadsheet to keep up with submissions? And if you do, could you provide an example of it?
I do not use an Excel spreadsheet. My process of tracking things is more than 40 years old before the advent of computers, so I do everything physically in actual file folders. So for example, to my right in my desk, there's a file folder for this story, which happens to be Smitty's Roadside Diner. And I have handwritten on it where it's been, what the response is. So if it gets rejected, file goes to another folder or another file drawer. If it gets submitted again, it goes back in this file drawer. Then I have file drawers for accepted stories, accepted and paid for, accepted but not paid for, published, etc. So mine's all very physical. I know writers who have spreadsheets and databases that are wonderful, and if I was starting today, I would probably have them. But to go back and bring everything up to speed would be a horrendous task.
It sounds like you have a very large office.
I actually have 2 bedrooms. One is where I work and what you see behind me, my books and stuff. And I have another room. There are 4-drawer filing cabinets and other materials. So, I mean, I've got 40 plus years, decades of writing that I have stored.
See, and you could have put all that on a CD and you've been able to clean up a room. And
Absolutely, but when the apocalypse hits and there's no power to run the computers, of course I
be ahead. he'll be heading and laughing at all the rest of us, right?
Yes.
Seen that Twilight episode.
Yeah, exactly. Then my glasses will break.
Oh, yeah,
So,
perfect. Anyone else? Do I see any hands or any messages?
oh my God.
Lindy, nope.
I answered all the questions, and now you're going to go out and become brilliant, highly successful writers. Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm just to tell you all and to pump up our anthology. A lot of us came into Malice in Memphis thinking that we would be great novelists and so forth and so on. And I wrote my very first ever short story for the Malice in Memphis anthology that just won the first place in the Imaginarium convention. So I'm really proud to be part of that collection. And I think all of us should be who contributed. So Ed, you have a hand?
Well, I was going to say, Michael, while you were speaking, I actually was doing some work because I got an email from an editor that situation was occurring exactly like you said. As I happened to come across a name, I reached out to an editor to see if their publication was accepting submissions. She emailed me back and said, no, we don't have any submissions, and I don't work with unknown authors. And then 2 days later, she emails me back and says, okay, I'm willing to take a chance on you based on what I've read on what you've been published in. And she gave me a challenge. I had to do up to 20,000 words for a cozy mystery, which I have never written before, and had to have it to her by October 1st. I spent a week reading about 6 different cozy mysteries, doing research, coming up with plot and stuff. So that kind of cut into my timeline. And I finally got it to her on the deadline. And she told me to poke her on Wednesday, and I haven't heard anything from her. And so I just kind of sit there. So I poked her again last night real casually, and she emailed me and she said, I'm sorry, I'm sick. I have not been able to do anything, but I will read your stuff. I'm eagerly awaiting whenever I can actually get out of my fog. So everything that you said was what would have been really helpful if I'd seen it a couple of weeks before, but it was the exact same pattern. She said that she only works in a wheelhouse with about 12 different authors who are established. Mm-hmm. She is willing to take a chance, and you have to follow the guidelines and so forth. So I found what you've said to be very on target and very true for my new experience.
Good.
Okay, anyone else?
Okay, I'll wrap this up. In that presentation that you're going to see a PDF of is my email address. If you have a follow-up question you don't think of until tomorrow or the next day, feel free to email me. Tell me where we met and ask your question, and I will do my best to respond to you.
And also your presentation, the web page has already been created on the Malice website, so it has a pending upload. But if you want to already go to the Malice web page and download his presentation, it's already been posted. And once we end the session, I'll get the audio and video posted as well. Jackie, up to you now.
Thank you very much. Michael, I can't remember enjoying a presentation so much. I hope you'll come back and talk with us again.
Okay.
Maybe not in the middle of a pandemic, but maybe we can find you'll come to Memphis and meet with us in person. Thank you very much. It was really great. And someday I hope some of our short stories will appear in your anthologies.
Okay, I look forward to reading some of them. So
Thank
I will
you very much.
clock out now, and thank you for inviting me.
Bye-bye.